The candle had barely been lit when the shouting began in the drawing-room of Pembroke Hall, and Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen at the door, her hand still on the cold brass handle, listening to her own name being spoken like a mistake that needed correcting. Lady Margaret Pembroke's voice cut through the evening air with a sharpness that made the maids in the corridor stop and lower their eyes. She embarrassed us in front of the entire county, Ashford. A future viscountess who cannot hold a conversation about anything beyond turnips and butter churns. I will not have it. Eleanor did not move. She had learned over many years in this house that stillness was often the safest place to stand. Ashford Pembroke sat near the fireplace with his head in his hands, the firelight throwing long shadows across his handsome, troubled face. He was not a cruel man, not truly, but he was a man who had been raised to fear the opinions of others more than he feared losing something good. Eleanor had known him since childhood, since the days when they used to run barefoot through the orchard behind her father's small farmhouse before either of them understood what it meant to be born into different stations of life. Back then, Ashford had loved her laugh, her quiet strength, the way she noticed things other people missed, like the exact moment a storm was coming or the precise way a sauce needed one more pinch of salt to sing. But that boy seemed farther away from her with every passing year, replaced slowly by a young man who cared very much about what was said of him in London drawing-rooms. The dinner party 3 nights earlier had gone wrong in ways Eleanor still did not fully understand. She had worn the gown Lady Margaret had chosen for her, had practiced her curtsy in front of the mirror until her knees ached, had memorized the names of every guest who was meant to attend. But when Lord Chesterton had asked her opinion on the recent troubles in Parliament, she had frozen, her mind going blank in the way it always did when too many eyes were fixed upon her at once. She had stammered something about the weather instead, and the table had gone quiet in that particular way that told her everyone was too polite to laugh out loud, though their eyes said otherwise. Later, when the subject turned to poetry, she had spoken with real passion about a book she loved, only to be gently reminded by Lady Margaret that a young lady ought not to have such strong opinions at the table. Eleanor had spent the rest of the evening in silence, picking at her food, wishing she were anywhere else. It was not that Eleanor lacked intelligence or grace. It was that the graces expected of her belonged to a world she had not been raised in, a world of practiced small talk and carefully rehearsed charm, while her own gifts lived somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter and, to the Pembroke family, entirely invisible. She had grown up in her father's modest farmhouse 2 miles from the great estate, the daughter of a gentleman farmer who had fallen on hard times after her mother's death. And it was there, in the small kitchen with its low beams and its smell of wood smoke, that Eleanor had truly come alive. She had spent her childhood afternoons beside old Grace Dunmore, the family's cook, learning how to coax flavor out of the plainest ingredients, how a handful of garden herbs could transform a dull broth into something worth remembering. While other girls her age were learning to embroider or to play the pianoforte, Eleanor was learning the secret language of food, though no one around her thought this a skill worth mentioning in polite company. Her engagement to Ashford had been arranged when she was only 16, a match born more of old family friendship and convenient land boundaries than of any grand romantic design, though for a time Eleanor had genuinely believed there was affection between them. Ashford's father, before his death, had spoken warmly of the match, remembering fondly the girl who had once outrun his son through the orchard rows. But since his passing, Lady Margaret had taken firm control of the household, and with her ambition came a new and uncomfortable scrutiny of everything Eleanor did, said, and wore. Every gathering became a test Eleanor did not know she was taking until she had already failed it. "She is a good and kind girl," Ashford said quietly now, still not lifting his head from his hands. "That must count for something, Mother." "Kindness will not secure your place among the peerage," Lady Margaret replied, her tone as cold and final as a closing door. "Goodness does not impress a room full of dukes and earls. If she is to be your wife, she must be made presentable, Ashford, or this family's reputation will suffer for it long after I am gone." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, the kind Lady Margaret was fond of using to let her words settle into the room like dust. There is a house in France, Madame Bellamy's establishment, near Lyon. The finest young ladies of good family are sent there to learn the graces expected of women in their position. 6 months, perhaps a year, and she will return transformed. Aline's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She had heard whispers of such places before, houses where daughters of good but struggling families were sent to be polished into acceptable brides, taught to walk and speak and think in ways that pleased husbands and mothers-in-law rather than themselves. She had never imagined such a fate would be discussed for her, and certainly not without her being present in the room to defend herself. She pushed the door open before she could stop herself, stepping into the fire-lit room with her chin raised, though her hands trembled at her sides. Both Ashford and his mother turned toward her, startled by her sudden appearance, and for a moment nobody spoke. "I am not a piece of unfinished furniture to be sent away for repair," Aline said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. It was, perhaps, the boldest thing she had said in that house in years. Lady Margaret's expression did not soften. "Aline, this is a private conversation." "It concerns my life," Aline answered. "I believe that entitles me to a voice in it." Ashford finally lifted his head, and when his eyes met hers, Aline searched them for some sign of the boy she remembered, some flicker of the loyalty she had once trusted completely. What she found instead was exhaustion, and something worse than exhaustion, resignation. He was not going to fight for her, not tonight, perhaps not ever again. "Aline," he said gently, though the gentleness did nothing to soften the blow of what followed, "perhaps it would be good for you. New experiences, new skills. You would return to me, even more accomplished than before." "You mean I would return more like the women your mother approves of," Aline said quietly. Nobody in the room denied it. The days that followed passed in a strange, heavy fog. Aline packed her few belongings with the help of her old nurse, a kind woman named Beatrice Langley, who had cared for her since she was a small child, and who now wept quietly as she folded Aline's gowns into a traveling trunk. "It is not fair, my dear girl," Beatrice murmured, "to be told you are not enough, when you have always been more than enough for anyone with the sense to see it." Aline said little in response, though she held on to those words in the days that followed, turning them over in her mind like a smooth stone kept in a pocket for comfort. She visited her father before she left, finding him in his study surrounded by unpaid bills and the quiet sadness that had settled over him since her mother's passing. He held her hands in his own weathered ones and told her that wherever she went, she carried her mother's spirit with her, a spirit that had never once needed anyone's permission to be remarkable. "Your mother could turn a handful of nothing into a feast that made grown men weep with gratitude," he said, his eyes distant with memory. "She never learned it from any fancy French house. She learned it from paying attention, from caring about the people she fed. Do not let anyone convince you that what lives inside you needs to be replaced, Aline. Perhaps it only needs a larger stage." Aline carried those words with her onto the ship that carried her across the channel, and through the long carriage ride from the coast toward Lyon, past vineyards and stone villages she had never imagined she would see with her own eyes. She watched the unfamiliar countryside roll past the carriage window and felt something unexpected stir beneath her sadness, a small and stubborn curiosity she had not permitted herself to feel since the night Lady Margaret's words had first reached her ears. She did not know what awaited her at Madame Bellamy's house. She did not know that within its walls, in a kitchen far from the formal drawing rooms where young ladies practiced their curtsies, something extraordinary was about to begin, something that would change not only her own life, but the way an entire country understood the meaning of a well-made meal. The carriage rattled to a stop before a grand stone house wrapped in ivy, its windows glowing gold against the deepening evening. Madame Bellamy herself stood waiting at the entrance, a tall, elegant woman with sharp eyes that seemed to measure Aline from head to toe within a single glance. "You are the English girl," she said, not unkindly, though there was little warmth in her tone either. "Come, we have much work to do before you are ready to return home." Aline climbed down from the carriage, her legs stiff from the long journey, and looked up at the house that would be her home for the coming months. She did not yet know that the true lessons waiting for her had nothing to do with curtsies or polite conversation, and everything to do with a talent she had not yet learned to name. That first night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed in her small assigned room, Alina rose quietly and wandered the halls of the great house, drawn by a smell that reached her even through closed doors, something rich and warm and achingly familiar, the smell of butter melting slowly over low heat, of herbs releasing their oils into simmering broth. She followed it without quite deciding to, past the formal rooms where portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilded frames, down a narrow staircase she was fairly certain she was not meant to use, until she found herself standing in the doorway of a vast kitchen lit by the glow of a great hearth. A man stood at the center of it all, sleeves rolled to his elbows, moving between pots and pans with the kind of quiet confidence Alina had never seen in anyone before, aristocrat or servant alike. He noticed her almost immediately, though he did not seem surprised. "You are the new English girl," he said, his accent thick but his English clear. "Madame Bellamy said you would arrive today. I did not expect you to find your way to my kitchen so soon." Alina should have apologized and returned to her room. That is what a proper young lady would have done. Instead, she found herself stepping further into the warm, fragrant room, drawn forward by something she could not entirely explain, something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like coming home. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I could not help but follow the smell." The man studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, curiosity replacing his initial indifference. "That," he said slowly, "is the first honest thing anyone in this house has said to me in quite some time." Alina did not yet know his name, did not yet know that he was considered one of the finest chefs in all of France, quietly employed by Madame Bellamy to feed her wealthy pupils while the young ladies upstairs learned lessons he privately considered a waste of good minds. She did not know that this chance meeting, in a kitchen she was never meant to enter, would set her entire life onto a path no one, least of all Ashford Pembroke and his ambitious mother, could ever have predicted. All she knew, standing there in the golden firelight with the smell of butter and thyme wrapped warmly around her, was that, for the first time since she had left England, she felt something close to hope. The chef's name, Alina learned that first night, was Julian Morrow, and he had once cooked for a minor prince before growing tired of court politics and retreating to the quieter position of feeding Madame Bellamy's household of hopeful young brides. He did not ask Alina to leave the kitchen that night. Instead, almost without thinking, he handed her a wooden spoon and asked her to stir a pot of simmering onions while he attended to a sauce on the other side of the great hearth. Alina took the spoon without hesitation, and for the next hour in near silence, she stirred and watched and breathed in the rich smells of a kitchen that felt, in every way that mattered, more like home than the grand drawing rooms of Pembroke Hall had ever felt. "You know your way around a pot," Julian observed, glancing at her sideways as she adjusted the heat beneath the onions without being told, sensing instinctively that they were beginning to catch. "Most young ladies who wander down here do not know a simmer from a boil." "I learned from our cook," Alina admitted. "Grace Dunmore. She raised me nearly as much as my own mother did in the kitchen if nowhere else." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "I was never meant to learn these things. It was simply where I felt most myself." Julian said nothing for a long moment, tasting the sauce from a small spoon, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There is nothing simple about knowing when a sauce needs salt before it is told to you," he said finally. "That is not luck. That is a gift, mademoiselle, whether anyone upstairs chooses to recognize it or not." The following morning, Alina attended her first lessons in the formal part of the house, where a stern instructor named Madame Foucher taught the young ladies how to enter a room properly, how to hold a fan, how to make polite conversation without ever revealing too much of one's own opinions. Alina sat among a dozen other girls, most of them daughters of wealthy English and French families, all of them chattering easily about fashions and suitors in a way that made Alina feel, once again, like an outsider peering in through a window at a world she did not quite belong to. She practiced her curtsy until her legs ached, recited proper greetings until the words lost all meaning. And by the time evening arrived, she felt more exhausted and more hollow than she had felt even on the long carriage ride from the coast. It became, over the following weeks, an unspoken habit. Each night, once the house had gone quiet, and the other young ladies had retired to their rooms to dream of husbands and ballrooms, Alina would slip down the narrow staircase to the kitchen, where Julian worked late preparing the next day's meals or simply experimenting for his own pleasure, testing combinations of flavor that no one upstairs would ever taste or appreciate. At first, she came only to watch. Soon she came to help, chopping vegetables with growing confidence, learning the proper way to hold a knife, the correct way to render fat from meat slowly so that it did not burn. Julian taught without lecturing, correcting her gently when her hand faltered, praising her without excessive flattery when she managed something well. "Taste," he told her one evening, holding a small spoon of broth to her lips, "is not simply about following instruction. Anyone can follow a recipe written on paper. Taste is about understanding what is missing before you are told, about knowing instinctively what a dish needs to become what it was always meant to be." Alina tasted the broth, closed her eyes, and after a moment said quietly that it needed a touch more time and perhaps a whisper of lemon to brighten it. Julian tasted it again himself, considered her words carefully, and then, to her surprise and quiet delight, added exactly what she had suggested. The broth transformed beneath her recommendation into something richer, more alive. "You have been holding this inside you for a very long time," Julian said, watching her carefully. "Wasted, mademoiselle, on people who never bothered to ask what you might become if given the chance." Alina did not know how to respond to such words, unused as she was to anyone treating her natural instincts as valuable rather than merely tolerable. She thought of Lady Margaret's cold assessment of her worth, of Ashford's quiet resignation as his mother arranged to send her away, and something inside her, something that had been quietly shrinking for years, began, slowly and cautiously, to grow again. Word soon reached Madame Bellamy that the English girl was often absent from her room late at night, though the older woman, to Alina's surprise, did not immediately forbid the arrangement. Madame Bellamy summoned Alina to her private study one afternoon, her sharp eyes studying the girl carefully as she explained, in her clipped and formal manner, that she had long known of Julian's late-night habits in the kitchen, and had, on occasion, allowed certain pupils to observe him if she believed it might serve some future purpose in their married lives, managing a household kitchen being no small skill for a future lady of the house. "I did not expect you to take to it with such devotion," Madame Bellamy admitted, folding her hands upon her desk. "Most girls visit once out of curiosity and never return, finding the work beneath them or simply tiresome. You, Miss Whitmore, have visited nearly every night for a month." Alina braced herself for a reprimand, certain that whatever freedom she had found in that warm kitchen was about to be taken from her as thoroughly as everything else in her life had been decided by others. Instead, Madame Bellamy surprised her. "Continue if it pleases you," she said simply. "I care little how a young lady arrives at grace and confidence, so long as she arrives at it eventually. Perhaps Julian's kitchen will succeed where my drawing-room lessons have failed to reach you fully." There was something almost knowing in the older woman's expression, as though she understood far more about Alina's situation, about the quiet desperation that had brought her across the sea, than Alina had realized. With this unexpected permission, Alina's evenings in the kitchen grew longer and more purposeful. Julian began teaching her not merely how to assist him, but how to think as a chef thought, how to consider the balance of a dish as a whole rather than a collection of separate ingredients, how a plate of food could tell a story if arranged and prepared with intention. He taught her the classical French techniques, the careful reduction of sauces, the precise timing required to sear meat properly without overcooking its delicate center, the patience demanded by pastry work, where a single moment's carelessness could ruin hours of careful labor. But what fascinated Alina most, and what soon began to fascinate Julian as well, was what happened when she combined these refined French techniques with the simple, honest ingredients of her English childhood. One evening, given free rein to prepare a dish of her own choosing, Alina reached instinctively for the humble vegetables Julian kept for the household staff's simpler meals. The same sort of root vegetables and hearty greens Grace Dunmore had always worked with back home. She prepared them not as they were traditionally served in England, boiled plainly and without much thought, but with the careful French techniques Julian had spent weeks teaching her, roasting them slowly with herbs, finishing them with a delicate reduction that highlighted rather than masked their natural sweetness. Julian tasted the result in silence, his expression unreadable for a long moment that made Alina's stomach tighten with anxious anticipation. Then slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face. "This," he said, tapping the plate with one finger, "is something new, mademoiselle. Something I have not tasted before, not in Lyon, not in Paris, not anywhere. You have taken what your country considers ordinary and made it extraordinary, without ever losing what made it honest to begin with." It was, Alina would later reflect, the first time in her entire life that someone had told her that the very things which made her different, the very upbringing that Lady Margaret had considered common and unrefined, might actually be a strength rather than a weakness to overcome. She began, in the weeks that followed, to experiment more boldly, blending the elegant precision of French cuisine with the honest, comforting flavors of the English countryside she had grown up in. She created a pastry filled with slow-cooked apples, and a hint of clove that Julian declared unlike anything served in the finest houses of France. She transformed a simple English stew into something layered and complex, using techniques of reduction and seasoning that elevated it far beyond its humble origins, while never abandoning the warmth and heartiness that made it comforting. Julian began, without quite announcing his intentions, to include small portions of Alina's creations among the dishes served to visiting guests of the house, curious to see how these accomplished palates would respond to something so unusual. The response, subtle at first, grew steadily more pronounced as the weeks passed. A visiting countess remarked, quite by accident within Alina's hearing, that the small tart served after dinner was unlike anything she had tasted in either England or France, possessing a warmth she could not quite place alongside a refinement she had not expected. A merchant's wife asked Madame Bellamy directly for the recipe of a particular sauce, only to be told, with careful vagueness, that it belonged to the house's private kitchen and could not be shared. Alina herself remained, for the most part unseen by these guests, still officially only a pupil learning proper etiquette rather than a source of the remarkable dishes appearing occasionally upon the household's table. But within the walls of Madame Bellamy's establishment, and increasingly within certain circles of Lyon's more curious culinary observers, whispers began to spread of a mysterious new flavor emerging from the old house on the hill, something neither entirely French nor entirely English, but something new altogether, something worth paying attention to. Alina received one letter from Ashford during those early months, brief and formal, inquiring after her progress in becoming, as he phrased it, more suited to her future role. She read it twice, searching for some trace of the boy who had once run beside her through the orchard, and found instead only the careful, distant tone of a man dutifully checking on an investment. She wrote back a short reply, mentioning nothing of the kitchen, nothing of Julian, nothing of the quiet transformation happening within her far from the drawing rooms Ashford imagined she was spending her days in. Some part of her, she realized with a small ache of sadness, no longer felt the need to share this part of herself with him, uncertain whether he would understand it even if she tried. Instead, she poured her energy into the kitchen, into the growing partnership between herself and Julian, who had begun, almost without either of them noticing the shift, to treat her less like a curious pupil and more like a genuine collaborator, someone whose instincts he trusted as much as his own decades of formal training. He began teaching her the business side of cooking as well, the careful sourcing of ingredients, the economics of running a proper kitchen, knowledge that would prove, though Alina did not yet know it, far more valuable to her future than any lesson in curtsying or polite conversation ever could have been. "You did not come here to learn how to be a proper wife," Julian told her one quiet evening, as they cleaned the kitchen together after a long day of preparation for an upcoming gathering. You came here, whether you knew it or not, to discover what you were always meant to become. Alina considered his words carefully as she wiped down the worn wooden counter, thinking of the frightened, uncertain girl who had arrived at this house months earlier, sent away by a family that considered her insufficient exactly as she was. That girl, she realized with quiet astonishment, felt increasingly distant now, replaced by someone steadier, someone who understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, precisely where her true talents lay. She did not yet know how far this newfound understanding would carry her, did not yet know that the small tarts and reimagined stews she created in this quiet kitchen would one day be spoken of throughout all of England. But standing there in the warm glow of the hearth, flour dusting her hands and the satisfying ache of honest work in her shoulders, Alina felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely herself. By the time winter settled over Lyon, wrapping the stone house in frost and turning the gardens outside into quiet fields of white, Alina had become someone the other pupils in Madame Bellamy's house scarcely recognized. She still attended her formal lessons each morning, still practiced the careful walk and measured speech expected of a future lady, but there was a new steadiness in the way she carried herself now, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with curtsies or polite conversation, and everything to do with what she had discovered in Julian's kitchen. The other young ladies noticed the change without understanding its source, whispering among themselves about the English girl who disappeared each evening after supper and returned each morning smelling faintly of butter and rosemary. Julian had begun entrusting her with greater responsibility as the months passed, allowing her to plan entire courses for smaller gatherings, to select ingredients from the market with her own judgment rather than his direct instruction, to correct younger kitchen staff when their technique faltered. It was during one such gathering, a modest dinner arranged for a visiting French diplomat and his wife, that Alina's growing reputation within the house took its first true step beyond the kitchen walls. The diplomat, a man named Etienne Fora, arrived with a reputation for exacting standards, having dined at the finest tables across Europe and grown famously difficult to impress. Julian, uncharacteristically nervous before the meal, spent the afternoon fussing over details that would ordinarily have seemed beneath his notice, adjusting the placement of herbs, tasting sauces repeatedly, insisting that a particular dish be remade twice before he was satisfied. Alina watched his uncharacteristic anxiety with quiet amusement, understanding that even the most accomplished among them still carried the weight of wanting to prove themselves. "Let me prepare the final course," she offered as the afternoon wore on, and Julian's frustration mounted over a dessert that refused to meet his exacting standards. He glanced at her, weighing the request, and then, to her surprise, stepped back from the counter entirely. "Show me what you have learned, then," he said simply. Alina set to work with a calm focus that surprised even herself, drawing upon everything Julian had taught her over the preceding months while trusting, at last, her own instincts to guide the final result. She prepared a delicate pastry filled with pears poached in spiced wine, finished with a dusting of something warm and unexpected, a technique she had adapted from an old recipe of Grace Dunmore's, reimagined through the precise French methods Julian had spent countless evenings teaching her. When the dish emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, even Julian paused to admire it before it was carried out to the dining room. The reaction, when it came, exceeded anything Alina had dared to hope for. Monsieur Fora, famously reserved in his praise, asked Madame Bellamy directly who had prepared such a remarkable dessert, declaring that he had not tasted anything quite like it in all his years of travel across the great capitals of Europe. Madame Bellamy, caught between pride and discretion, admitted only that the house's kitchen had been experimenting with new combinations of flavor, careful not to reveal that the dish had come not from her celebrated chef, but from an English pupil sent to her house for entirely different purposes. Word of the evening spread quickly, as such things tended to do among the interconnected circles of Lyon's wealthy families. Within days, Madame Bellamy received several inquiries from households eager to know more about the mysterious new flavors emerging from her establishment. And though she remained careful to protect the details of her kitchen's inner workings, she could not entirely suppress her own growing curiosity about the quiet English girl who had, without any grand announcement, begun to reshape what was possible within her walls. Alina herself remained largely unaware of the full extent of the impression she had made, focused as she was on the steady, satisfying rhythm of her work rather than on any thought of reputation or renown. It was Julian who first suggested, some weeks later, that she might consider what such a talent could mean for her future beyond the walls of Madame Bellamy's house. "You cannot remain hidden in this kitchen forever," he told her one evening, as they prepared ingredients for the following day's meals. "What you have is too rare to waste on private dinners for a handful of curious diplomats. There are kitchens in Paris, in London, entire worlds of opportunity for someone with your gift, if you are willing to reach for them." Alina considered his words carefully, aware of the complicated tangle of feelings they stirred within her. She thought of Ashford, waiting for her return in England, expecting a wife transformed into someone more suited to the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. She thought of Lady Margaret's cold assessment of her worth, of the quiet shame she had carried for so many years over not fitting neatly into the mold expected of her. And she thought, too, of the growing certainty settling within her that whatever life awaited her back in England, it would not, could not, look anything like the life Ashford and his mother had imagined for her when they sent her away. "I do not know what I am meant to do with all this," Alina admitted quietly, setting down the knife she had been using to prepare a bundle of fresh herbs. "I was sent here to become a proper wife, Julian, not a chef, not anything close to what I have become in this kitchen." Julian regarded her steadily, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "And what," he asked, "do you wish to become, Alina? Not what you were sent here to be, not what is expected of you. What do you wish for, when you allow yourself to imagine a life shaped entirely by your own hand?" It was a question Alina had never truly permitted herself to consider. So thoroughly had her life been shaped by the expectations and decisions of others, first her father's arrangement of her engagement, then Lady Margaret's decision to send her away, each choice made on her behalf rather than by her own will. She sat with the question for a long moment, turning it over carefully, before answering with a quiet honesty that surprised her. "I wish to feed people something true," she said slowly, feeling her way toward words she had never spoken aloud before. "Not simply something that impresses them or follows the fashionable rules of the moment. Something honest. Something that reminds them of home, even while showing them something entirely new." Julian smiled at this, a genuine warmth spreading across his weathered face. "Then that," he said simply, "is what you must build your life around, whatever obstacles stand in your way." The following weeks brought a shift in the nature of Alina's education at Madame Bellamy's house. Alongside the formal lessons in etiquette and conversation that continued each morning, Julian began teaching her the deeper business of running a proper kitchen, the careful management of costs and suppliers, the delicate art of training and directing kitchen staff, the countless practical considerations that separated a talented home cook from someone capable of managing an establishment that served hundreds of discerning guests. He spoke to her of Paris, of London, of the great restaurants and grand households where a chef of true skill could build not merely a reputation, but an entire legacy. Alina absorbed this knowledge with the same focused determination she had once reserved for mastering the proper curtsy, though now the effort felt entirely different, driven not by fear of failing to meet someone else's expectations, but by genuine excitement for a future she was beginning, cautiously, to imagine for herself. She wrote to her father during this period, describing, in careful and measured terms, the unexpected direction her time in France had taken, uncertain how he would receive news that his daughter had spent her months abroad in a kitchen rather than a drawing room. His reply, when it arrived weeks later, brought tears to her eyes, filled as it was with a pride and encouragement she had not dared to hope for, reminding her once again of her mother's own remarkable gift for transforming simple ingredients into something worth remembering. She did not write to Ashford of these developments, uncertain how to explain a transformation he had never imagined when he agreed to send her away, uncertain whether he would understand or appreciate the woman she was slowly becoming, so different from the quiet, uncertain girl who had left Pembroke Hall many months earlier. His letters continued to arrive with dutiful regularity, each one growing shorter and more distant than the last, filled increasingly with news of London society and his mother's ambitious plans for their eventual wedding, plans that seemed, to Alina's growing unease, entirely disconnected from any conversation about who she actually was or what she actually wanted from her own life. It was during a particularly busy week of preparation for a grand gathering, one of the largest events Madame Bellamy's house had hosted in years, that Alina's talents faced their most significant test yet. A visiting English lord, traveling through France on his way to Italy, had requested lodging and hospitality at the house, bringing with him a small party of fellow travelers eager to sample the refined French cuisine they had heard so much about. Julian, overwhelmed by preparations for the evening's elaborate menu, entrusted Alina with an entire course of her own design, the first time she had been given such complete creative freedom for an event of this scale. Alina spent days planning the course, drawing upon everything she had learned over the preceding months, determined to create something that honored both her English roots and the French techniques that had transformed her understanding of what food could become. She settled finally on a dish built around a rich, slow-cooked game bird, prepared with a sauce that balanced the deep, earthy flavors favored in English country cooking with the delicate precision of French reduction techniques, finished with a garnish of foraged autumn herbs that added an unexpected brightness to the dish's overall richness. The evening of the gathering arrived with a tension Alina had not felt since her earliest days in Julian's kitchen, though this time the nervousness carried with it an undercurrent of genuine excitement rather than fear. She watched from a small window in the kitchen door as her dish was carried out to the assembled guests, her heart pounding as she waited to learn whether her creation would be received with the same enthusiasm as her earlier, smaller successes. The reaction, when it finally reached the kitchen through the excited chatter of the serving staff, exceeded even Julian's considerable expectations. The visiting lord himself had requested to know the identity of the chef responsible for such an extraordinary dish, declaring it unlike anything he had encountered in his considerable travels across the great houses of Europe. Madame Bellamy, standing at the edge of the dining room, had watched the reaction with an expression of careful calculation, understanding perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the house the true significance of what was unfolding within her kitchen walls. It was this evening, more than any other before it, that marked a genuine turning point in Alina's understanding of her own capabilities. She was no longer merely a talented pupil assisting an accomplished chef, absorbing lessons and occasionally contributing small, well-received dishes to the household's private meals. She had, through months of careful study and patient practice, become something far more significant, a genuine creative force capable of standing entirely on her own merits, ready, whether she fully realized it yet or not, to take her place among the finest culinary minds of her generation. Julian found her later that evening, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen after the guests had retired, and the exhausted serving staff had finally gone to bed, staring thoughtfully into the dying embers of the great hearth. He said nothing at first, simply settling into the chair beside her, allowing the comfortable silence between them to stretch for several long moments before finally speaking. "You understand now, I think," he said quietly, "what I have been trying to tell you these many months. This is not a hobby you have stumbled into, Alina. This is who you are." Alina turned to look at him, feeling the weight of his words settle over her with a clarity she had never quite experienced before. She thought of Pembroke Hall, of the cold, disapproving eyes of Lady Margaret, of Ashford's quiet resignation as he agreed to send her away in hopes she would return transformed into someone more acceptable. She thought, too, of the quiet, uncertain girl who had wandered into this kitchen on her very first night in France, drawn forward by nothing more than the comforting smell of butter and thyme. That girl, she understood now with complete certainty, was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the true shape of her own worth. "I do not know what will happen when I return to England," she admitted quietly, the uncertainty of her future settling heavily upon her despite the pride she felt in what she had accomplished. "I do not know if there is any place in that world for what I have become." Julian reached over and took her hand in his own weathered fingers, his expression warm with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years watching talent bloom in unexpected places. "Then perhaps," he said gently, "it is time you stopped asking whether there is a place for you in that world, and began asking instead whether that world is ready to make room for someone like you." Alina did not have an answer for him that night, though his words settled deep within her, planting a seed of determination that would, in the months and years that followed, grow into something far larger and more remarkable than either of them could have fully imagined in that quiet, fire-lit kitchen. Outside, the winter snow continued to fall gently over the sleeping city of Lyon, while inside, a transformation that had begun almost by accident continued steadily toward its inevitable conclusion, one that would eventually reach far beyond the walls of Madame Bellamy's house, across the Channel, and into the very heart of English society itself. Spring arrived in Lyon with a gentleness that felt almost startling after the long, gray months of winter, the gardens surrounding Madame Bellamy's house slowly filling with the first tender shoots of the season. Alina had now spent nearly 8 months within its walls, and the letters arriving from England had grown increasingly insistent, Lady Margaret's precise handwriting demanding to know when Alina's transformation would be considered complete enough to warrant her return. Ashford's letters, by contrast, had grown so infrequent and so brief that Alina sometimes wondered whether he thought of her at all beyond the occasional dutiful inquiry required by their engagement. It was during this period that Alina faced a decision she had not anticipated needing to make so soon. Madame Bellamy summoned her one afternoon to her private study, the same room where Alina had once braced herself for a reprimand regarding her nightly visits to the kitchen. This time, however, the older woman's expression carried none of the careful reserve Alina had grown accustomed to. "I have received a most unusual request," Madame Bellamy began, folding her hands upon her desk in the manner Alina had come to recognize as a sign of serious deliberation. "The household of the Baron de Montfort has heard, through channels I cannot entirely trace, of certain remarkable dishes emerging from my kitchen this past year. They have requested that my chef prepare the entire menu for a gathering of considerable importance, one that will include several members of the French nobility, and perhaps, I am told, a representative of the English ambassador as well." Alina waited, uncertain why Madame Bellamy was sharing this information with her directly rather than simply relaying instructions to Julian, as she ordinarily would have done. "Monsieur Moreau has informed me," Madame Bellamy continued, her sharp eyes studying Alina carefully, "that he wishes for you to take the lead in preparing this menu with his guidance and support, but under your own direction. This is, as you understand, considerably beyond the scope of what I originally intended when I agreed to allow your visits to his kitchen." Alina felt her heart quicken, a mixture of excitement and genuine fear settling over her at the magnitude of what was being proposed. "I do not know if I am ready for such responsibility," she admitted honestly. "Neither do I," Madame Bellamy replied, with a small, unexpected smile. "But Julian Moreau is not a man given to reckless praise, Miss Whitmore, and if he believes you capable of this, I am inclined to trust his judgment. Besides," she added, her tone growing more thoughtful, "I confess a certain curiosity of my own regarding what you might create when given complete freedom to do so." Alina accepted the challenge with a determination that surprised even herself, spending the following weeks in careful preparation, planning each course of the menu with meticulous attention, testing and refining recipes late into the night with Julian's steady guidance always present, but increasingly stepping back to allow her own instincts to lead. She drew inspiration from every corner of her experience, From Grace Dunmore's humble country recipes to the refined French techniques Julian had spent months teaching her, weaving them together into something that felt entirely her own, neither purely English nor purely French, but something new altogether, a genuine reflection of the unusual journey that had brought her to this moment. The evening of the Baron de Montfort's gathering arrived with a tension unlike anything Aline had experienced before, the weight of an entire reputation, both her own and Madame Bellamy's establishment, resting upon the success of the meal she had spent weeks preparing. She worked alongside Julian and the household's kitchen staff with a focused intensity that left little room for the anxious thoughts threatening constantly to intrude upon her concentration, each dish requiring her complete and undivided attention as it moved through the careful stages of preparation. The guests arrived in grand carriages throughout the early evening, their fine clothes and confident bearing a reminder of the exacting standards Aline would need to meet if her efforts were to succeed. Among them, to Aline's considerable surprise, was a representative of the English ambassador, a man named Henry Ashcombe, whose presence brought an unexpected wave of nervousness, aware as she was that any success or failure this evening might eventually find its way back to England through channels entirely beyond her control. The meal unfolded across several careful hours, each course carried from the kitchen to the elegant dining room where Aline could not follow, forced instead to wait anxiously for whatever news might filter back through the exhausted serving staff moving between the two spaces. The first reports arrived cautiously optimistic, guests murmuring appreciatively over the opening courses without any particular outburst of enthusiasm. It was not until the main course, the same rich, carefully balanced preparation of game bird that had first proven Aline's talents months earlier, now refined further through weeks of careful adjustment, that the reaction shifted into something far more remarkable. Julian himself, watching through the small window in the kitchen door, turned back to Aline with an expression of genuine astonishment. "They have stopped their conversation entirely," he reported, his voice carrying a note of wonder Aline had never heard from him before. "The entire table, Aline. Every guest has fallen silent, simply to taste what you have made." The evening concluded with the Baron himself requesting to meet the chef responsible for such an extraordinary meal, a request that placed Madame Bellamy in an unusually delicate position, forced to decide whether to reveal that the true architect of the evening's remarkable success was not her celebrated resident chef, but a young Englishwoman sent to her house for entirely different purposes. After a moment's careful consideration, Madame Bellamy made her choice, and Aline found herself, for the first time, standing before a room full of French nobility and one very surprised English diplomat, formally acknowledged as the creator of the meal that had captivated them all. The Baron de Montfort, an elderly man with kind eyes and an evident passion for fine food, took Aline's hand warmly, declaring that he had not tasted anything so remarkable in decades of hosting gatherings across the finest houses of Europe. "You have a gift, mademoiselle," he told her, his voice carrying genuine admiration rather than mere polite flattery. "A rare and precious gift that deserves far greater recognition than a single private dinner in Lyon." It was Henry Ashcombe, however, whose reaction would prove most consequential to Aline's future, though she could not have known this at the time. The young diplomat approached her quietly after the other guests had finished offering their congratulations, his expression thoughtful and curious in a way that suggested genuine rather than merely polite interest. "I confess," he said, "I did not expect to encounter such extraordinary English talent hidden away in a French finishing house, Miss Whitmore. May I ask how you came to develop such remarkable skill?" Aline found herself explaining, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence, the unusual path that had brought her to this moment, from her childhood afternoons in Grace Dunmore's kitchen to her chance discovery of Julian's late-night cooking sessions during her very first evening at Madame Bellamy's house. Henry listened with evident fascination, asking thoughtful questions about her techniques and her influences, and by the time their conversation concluded, Alina had the distinct sense that she had made an impression far beyond what any single evening's meal could have accomplished alone. "I have some acquaintance with certain circles in London," Henry mentioned as their conversation drew to a close. "Individuals who take a genuine interest in matters of fine cuisine and who would, I suspect, find your story and your talent quite remarkable. I hope you will not think me presumptuous if I mention your name in the appropriate quarters upon my return home." Alina thanked him with genuine gratitude, though she did not yet fully grasp the significance of what he was offering, the quiet beginning of a reputation that would soon extend far beyond the walls of a single kitchen in Lyon. She returned to her small room that night exhausted but exhilarated, replaying the evening's events over and over in her mind, still scarcely able to believe the reception her carefully crafted meal had received. Julian found her the following morning in the kitchen, already beginning preparations for the day's ordinary meals. Despite the late hour, she had finally found sleep the night before. He regarded her with an expression of quiet pride that warmed her more than any of the previous evenings' grand compliments had managed to accomplish. "You have proven, beyond any doubt, what I have believed about you since our very first evening together," he said simply. "The question now, Alina, is what you intend to do with this proof." Alina considered his words carefully as she continued her work, chopping vegetables with the steady, confident rhythm that had become second nature to her over the preceding months. She thought again of England, of Ashford and Lady Margaret waiting for her return, of the life that had been planned for her long before she ever understood what possibilities existed beyond it. The letters from home continued to arrive with their persistent inquiries about when her transformation would be considered sufficiently complete, entirely unaware of the true nature of the transformation that had actually taken place within her. "I do not know how to explain any of this to them," Alina admitted quietly. "They sent me here expecting a proper lady to return, someone polished enough to grace their drawing rooms without embarrassment. What will they say when they learn what I have actually become?" Julian paused in his own work, turning to face her directly, his expression serious in a way that commanded her full attention. "Alina, you must understand something clearly. You do not owe anyone an explanation for becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. If they cannot recognize the value of what stands before them, that is their failure of vision, not a flaw in you that requires correction." The words settled deeply within Alina, echoing the similar wisdom her own father had offered before she left England. And slowly, over the following weeks, they began to shape a growing resolve within her, a quiet but unshakable determination that whatever awaited her upon her eventual return home, she would not allow herself to be diminished back into the uncertain, apologetic girl who had left Pembroke Hall many months earlier. She had discovered, in this unexpected kitchen far from everything familiar, not merely a talent for cooking but a fundamental understanding of her own worth, one that no amount of disapproval from Lady Margaret or quiet resignation from Ashford could ever fully take from her again. As spring deepened into early summer, word of the remarkable meal prepared for the Baron de Montfort continued to spread through the interconnected circles of Lyon society, each retelling adding new embellishments to the story of the mysterious English girl whose talents had captivated a room full of skeptical nobility. Alina remained largely unaware of the full extent of this growing reputation, focused as she was on the steady, satisfying work that continued to fill her days. But Julian watched the quiet accumulation of interest with a knowing satisfaction, certain that the young woman he had first noticed wandering curiously into his kitchen was destined for a future far larger than either of them had originally imagined. The letter from Henry Ashcombe arrived nearly 2 months after the gathering at the Baron de Montfort's estate, delivered to Madame Bellamy's house on a warm summer morning that found Alina in the kitchen garden, gathering fresh herbs for the day's meals. Madame Bellamy herself brought the letter to her, an unusual gesture that immediately signaled its importance, and Alina set down her basket of herbs with trembling hands as she broke the seal and began to read. Henry wrote with evident excitement, explaining that he had, as promised, spoken of Aliner's remarkable talents to several acquaintances within London's more discerning social circles, including, to Aliner's considerable astonishment, a gentleman named William Carow, who owned a series of increasingly fashionable dining establishments across the city, and who had expressed genuine interest in meeting the young Englishwoman whose culinary innovations had so impressed the guests at a private French gathering months earlier. Henry explained further that Mr. Carow was currently in the process of opening a new and ambitious establishment near the fashionable district of Mayfair, one intended to challenge the traditional dominance of French cuisine within London's dining scene by offering something entirely different, a genuine reimagining of English cooking elevated through refined technique, precisely the sort of creative vision Aliner had already begun to develop within Julian's kitchen. Aliner read the letter twice, then a third time, scarcely able to believe the opportunity it seemed to be offering. She brought it immediately to Julian, who read it with careful attention before looking up at her with an expression that mixed genuine excitement with something more bittersweet. "This is precisely the sort of opportunity I hoped might find you eventually," he said, though his voice carried a note of wistfulness Aliner had not expected. "Though I confess I did not anticipate it arriving quite so soon, or requiring you to leave us quite so suddenly." The reality of the decision before her settled heavily upon Aliner as the following days passed. To pursue this opportunity would mean returning to England far sooner than originally planned, and doing so not as the transformed, socially polished bride Lady Margaret and Ashford had expected, but as something else entirely, a young woman with genuine professional ambitions that had nothing to do with the drawing rooms and dinner parties of aristocratic society. It would mean confronting, directly and immediately, the difficult conversation she had been quietly dreading since her very first evening in Julian's kitchen, the conversation in which she would need to explain to Ashford and his mother precisely who she had become during her time away from them. She wrote to her father first, seeking his counsel in a matter that felt too significant to navigate entirely on her own. His reply arrived with characteristic warmth and encouragement, reminding her once again of her mother's own remarkable spirit and urging her, in the gentlest possible terms, to trust the path that had so clearly revealed itself to her during her time in France. "Your mother would have been prouder of this news," he wrote, "than of any successful marriage into a title, however grand the name attached to it. Follow this path, my dear girl, wherever it may lead you." Emboldened by her father's blessing, Aliner made her decision. She would return to England, but not simply to resume the life that had been planned for her before her departure. She would return prepared to pursue the opportunity Henry Ashcombe had opened for her, whatever complications this might create with regard to her engagement to Ashford Pembroke. The preparations for her departure from Madame Bellamy's house unfolded with a bittersweet mixture of excitement and genuine sadness, as Aliner recognized how profoundly the past year had reshaped her understanding of herself and her own capabilities. Madame Bellamy, in a final private conversation before Aliner's departure, offered words of unexpected warmth, admitting that she had rarely witnessed such a genuine and complete transformation among the many young ladies who had passed through her house over the years, though she noted, with a small, knowing smile, that it was not at all the transformation she had originally been engaged to provide. "Your fiancé's mother sent you to me expecting a properly refined young lady," Madame Bellamy observed. "Instead, I am sending home a genuine artist. I suspect she will be considerably less pleased with this particular outcome than she originally anticipated." Julian's farewell proved the most difficult of all. The bond that had formed between teacher and student over the preceding year running far deeper than either had perhaps fully acknowledged until the moment of parting arrived. He presented Aliner, on her final evening in the kitchen that had become her true home during her time in France, with a carefully bound collection of his own recipes and techniques, painstakingly recorded in his careful handwriting, along with a set of fine cooking knives he had commissioned specially for her use. "These tools have served me well for many years," he told her, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely permitted himself to display openly. I trust they will serve you even better as you carry forward everything we have discovered together in this kitchen." Alina embraced him with genuine gratitude, struggling to find words adequate to express what his patient mentorship had meant to her over the preceding year. "I would not be who I am today without you," she told him simply. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have given me." "You owe me nothing beyond continuing to create the sort of honest, remarkable food you have shown yourself capable of producing," Julian replied. "That will be thanks enough, Alina. More than enough." The journey back across the channel felt entirely different from the anxious, uncertain voyage that had carried Alina to France a year earlier. She watched the English coastline emerge slowly from the morning mist with a complicated mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Aware that whatever awaited her at Pembroke Hall would require a confrontation she had spent months quietly preparing herself for, without ever knowing precisely how it might unfold. Ashford met her carriage himself upon her arrival, and Alina searched his familiar face carefully as he helped her down, looking for some sign of how deeply their relationship might have shifted during her extended absence. He looked older somehow, more careworn than she remembered, though his smile as he greeted her carried a warmth she had not expected after so many months of increasingly distant correspondence. "You look wonderful, Alina," he said, studying her with evident curiosity. "Different somehow, though I confess I cannot quite place what has changed." Lady Margaret's greeting, by contrast, carried her characteristic reserve, her sharp eyes studying Alina's bearing and manner with the critical assessment of someone determining whether her considerable investment had yielded the expected return. "You carry yourself with more confidence than before," she observed, though her tone remained carefully noncommittal. "We shall see, in the coming days, whether this confidence extends to the social graces you were sent to acquire." Alina said little in response, choosing instead to settle back into the familiar rhythms of Pembroke Hall while she considered how best to broach the subject of the letter she carried from Henry Ashcombe and the opportunity it represented. She found herself, in the days that followed her return, observing the household and its rigid expectations with a clarity she had not possessed before her departure, recognizing more fully than ever the profound gap between the life that had been planned for her and the future she now genuinely desired for herself. The conversation she had been dreading finally arrived nearly a week after her return, during a quiet evening when Ashford sought her out in the small sitting room where she had taken to spending her free hours, working through the collection of recipes Julian had given her, adapting and refining ideas for the meeting she had already arranged with William Carow in London. "You have changed, Alina," Ashford said, settling into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Not merely in confidence, as my mother observed. Something deeper has shifted within you." Alina set aside her papers, recognizing that the moment for honesty had finally arrived. "I did not spend my time in France learning to be a better version of the wife your mother expected," she said carefully, watching his face for his reaction. "I discovered, instead, an entirely different path for my life, one that has nothing to do with drawing rooms or dinner parties, at least not in the way your family has always understood them." She explained, then, the full story of her time in France, from her chance discovery of Julian's kitchen on her very first night, to the remarkable evening with the Baron de Montfort, from Henry Ashcombe's unexpected letter to the opportunity now awaiting her in London. Ashford listened in silence throughout her explanation, his expression shifting through surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like genuine admiration, though it remained tangled with visible uncertainty about what this meant for the future they had long assumed they would share together. "You wish to work in a kitchen," he said finally, when she had concluded her explanation. "Not simply as a private pastime, but as a genuine profession in the public dining establishments of London." "Yes," Alina confirmed, her voice steady despite the anxiety twisting within her chest. "I understand this is not what you or your mother envisioned when you sent me away, Ashford. I understand it may complicate our engagement considerably. But I cannot return to being the uncertain, apologetic girl I was before I left this house. I have found something in myself I did not know existed, and I am not willing to abandon it, not even for the sake of the life we once planned together." Ashford sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, and Alina watched him carefully, uncertain whether she was about to witness the final collapse of their long engagement or something else entirely. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight of genuine reflection that surprised her. "I have spent this past year growing increasingly ashamed of how easily I agreed to send you away," he admitted quietly. "My mother's expectations have shaped so much of my life, Alina, more than I have perhaps wanted to acknowledge, even to myself. Watching you now, hearing what you have accomplished, what you have discovered about your own capabilities, I find myself wondering whether I have spent too many years measuring worth by standards that were never truly mine to begin with." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I do not know what shape our future together might take, given this new direction your life has taken. But I find that I do not wish to stand in the way of what you have discovered in yourself, whatever complications this might create for my mother's ambitions, or indeed for my own long-held assumptions about what our marriage would look like." It was not, Alina understood, a complete resolution to the complicated questions now facing them both, but it represented something she had not entirely dared to hope for, a genuine willingness on Ashford's part to reconsider the rigid expectations that had governed so much of their relationship. She left their conversation that evening with a cautious sense of hope, uncertain exactly what awaited her in the coming months, but increasingly confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as the transformed, self-assured woman she had become, rather than the uncertain girl who had once been sent away to be refined into someone else entirely. Lady Margaret's reaction, when Alina finally summoned the courage to explain her intentions directly, proved every bit as difficult as Alina had anticipated, though perhaps not in the way she had originally feared. Rather than the explosive anger Alina had braced herself for, Lady Margaret's response carried a cold, controlled disappointment that felt, in its own way, considerably more painful to endure. "I sent you to France to become a suitable wife for my son," Lady Margaret said, her voice carefully measured despite the visible tension in her posture. "Not to become a common tradeswoman, laboring in kitchens for the entertainment of London's fashionable classes. Do you understand what this would mean for the Pembroke name, Alina? For Ashford standing among his peers?" "I understand your concerns," Alina replied, holding her ground despite the familiar instinct to shrink beneath Lady Margaret's disapproval that had governed so much of her behavior in this house before her departure. "But I am no longer willing to shape my entire life around fears of what others might think, Lady Margaret. I have discovered something remarkable within myself, a genuine talent that has already earned recognition from some of the finest palates in France. I do not intend to abandon it simply because it does not align with your original expectations." The following weeks brought a tense and uncertain period within Pembroke Hall, as Lady Margaret continued to voice her objections, while Alina remained firm in her determination to pursue the opportunity Henry Ashcombe had helped arrange. Ashford, to his credit, maintained the cautious support he had first offered during their initial conversation, though Alina could see the visible strain this created between him and his mother, whose formidable will had shaped so much of his life until this point. The meeting with William Carow, when it finally arrived, took place at a modest but elegantly appointed office near the site of his planned new establishment, still under construction, but already generating considerable interest among London's fashionable set. Carow himself proved to be a shrewd, energetic man in his middle years, his sharp eyes assessing Alina carefully as she explained her culinary philosophy and the unique combination of English tradition and French technique that had defined her work over the preceding year. "Ashcombe spoke highly of your talents," Carow said, studying her with evident interest as she described some of the dishes she had developed during her time with Julian Morrow. "Though I confess I had not expected quite such a young and unassuming woman to possess the sort of ambitious vision I am seeking for this establishment." Alina felt a familiar flicker of the old uncertainty that had once governed her interactions with skeptical strangers, but she pushed past it, drawing instead upon the confidence she had built over her year in France. "I understand the skepticism," she acknowledged calmly. "I would ask only that you allow me the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities directly, rather than judging them based on my age or my gender alone." Caro's expression shifted into something approaching genuine respect at this response, and he agreed, after further discussion, to arrange a formal tasting, inviting several of his most trusted associates and potential investors to sample Alina's cooking before making any final decision about her role within his new establishment. Alina spent the following weeks in intense preparation, securing access to a small private kitchen through a family connection, and working tirelessly to perfect a menu that would showcase the full range of her culinary vision. The tasting itself, when it finally arrived on a crisp autumn evening, gathered together an intimidating collection of London's more discerning food enthusiasts, including several prominent restaurant owners, a well-known food critic whose opinions carried considerable weight within fashionable circles, and Caro himself, watching with careful attention as each course was presented and evaluated. Alina moved through the evening with a calm focus that surprised even herself, drawing upon every lesson Julian had patiently taught her over the preceding year, presenting dish after dish that balanced familiar English comfort with unexpected refinement and precision. The reaction from the assembled guests grew increasingly enthusiastic as the evening progressed, culminating in a final dessert course, a reimagined version of a traditional English pudding transformed through careful French technique into something both comfortingly familiar and genuinely surprising, that drew genuine applause from several of the guests. A response, Caro later confided, was exceedingly rare among this particular crowd of jaded palates. The food critic, a notoriously difficult man named Charles Fenwick, requested to speak with Alina directly following the meal, his expression carrying none of the dismissive skepticism she had feared might greet a young woman claiming such ambitious culinary talent. "I have eaten in the finest establishments across this continent," Fenwick told her, his tone carrying genuine admiration rather than the condescension Alina had braced herself for. "I have not, in recent memory, encountered a young talent quite so capable of transforming familiar ingredients into something so entirely unexpected. Where, precisely, did you develop such remarkable skill?" Alina explained, briefly, the unusual circumstances that had brought her to this point, her chance discovery of a talented chef's kitchen during what was meant to be a year of learning proper social etiquette. Fenwick listened with evident fascination, and by the conclusion of their conversation, Alina understood with growing certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead of her, the evening's tasting had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that her talents were genuine and considerable, deserving of serious professional recognition regardless of her unconventional path to this moment. Caro offered her the position she had hoped for before the evening had even fully concluded, appointing her as the head of his new establishment's kitchen, a position of considerable authority and responsibility that would have seemed almost unimaginable to Alina only a year earlier, when she had been a quiet, uncertain young woman sent away by a family that considered her insufficient exactly as she was. She accepted the position with a mixture of excitement and genuine trepidation, aware of the significant challenges that would accompany such an unconventional role, particularly for a woman operating within the traditionally male-dominated world of professional cooking. The news of her new position spread quickly through London's social circles, generating a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and, inevitably, considerable disapproval among certain, more conservative quarters of aristocratic society. Lady Margaret's reaction, when the news finally reached Pembroke Hall in full detail, proved every bit as severe as Alina had anticipated, the older woman declaring in no uncertain terms that she would not permit her future daughter-in-law to pursue what she considered a scandalous and entirely inappropriate occupation for a woman of her intended station. "You will bring shame upon this family," Lady Margaret declared during a heated confrontation that Ashford attempted, with limited success, to mediate between the two women he cared for most in his life. No respectable household will receive you if word spreads that you labor in a public kitchen like a common tradeswoman. Then perhaps, Alina replied, her voice steady despite the tension of the confrontation. Those households were never worth associating with in the first place, if they cannot recognize genuine talent and honest work simply because it does not align with their narrow expectations of what a woman's ambitions should be. Ashford, caught between his mother's fierce disapproval and his own growing admiration for the woman Alina had become, found himself facing a genuine crisis of conscience regarding his own values and priorities. The following weeks brought a painful period of reflection for him, as he grappled with the realization that his entire life had been shaped by his mother's ambitions and expectations, leaving little room for his own genuine desires or beliefs about what truly mattered. The confrontation finally reached its inevitable conclusion during a difficult conversation between Ashford and Alina, held in the same small sitting room where they had first discussed her intentions to pursue her culinary ambitions. Ashford arrived with an expression of genuine determination that Alina had rarely witnessed in him before, a clear signal that he had reached some important decision during his weeks of careful reflection. "I have spent my entire life measuring my worth by my mother's standards," he told Alina, his voice carrying a conviction she had not heard from him in longer than she could remember. "Watching you these past months, watching you build something genuinely remarkable through your own courage and determination, I have come to understand how deeply I have failed to live according to my own values, choosing instead the comfortable path of simply meeting expectations set by others." He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully before continuing. "I do not know if I can offer you the sort of partnership you truly deserve, Alina, not while my mother continues to hold such considerable influence over my decisions and my sense of what matters most in life. But I believe I owe it to both of us to attempt to become someone worthy of standing beside the remarkable woman you have become, rather than continuing to expect you to shrink yourself to fit within the narrow confines of my mother's ambitions." It was, Alina understood, not a perfect resolution to the complicated questions surrounding their engagement, but it represented a genuine and meaningful shift in Ashford's understanding of himself and his priorities, one that offered at least the possibility of a future partnership built on more equal and honest foundations than the arrangement that had originally bound them together. She accepted his words with cautious hope, uncertain exactly what shape their relationship might ultimately take, but increasingly confident that whatever the future held, she would face it as her true, transformed self, rather than the uncertain girl who had once been sent away to be refined into someone else entirely. The opening of William Caro's new establishment, which he had decided to name simply the Whitmore Table in recognition of the remarkable young chef, whose vision had shaped its entire culinary identity, arrived on a cold winter evening several months after Alina's return from France. The restaurant's dining room filled with a mixture of curious skeptics and genuine admirers, drawn by the growing whispers of a talented young Englishwoman whose innovative approach to traditional cuisine had already begun to generate considerable excitement within London's discerning culinary circles. Alina moved through the evening's preparations with the same calm, focused determination that had carried her through every previous test of her considerable talents, drawing upon everything she had learned during her remarkable year in France, while remaining true to the honest, comforting flavors of her English upbringing that had always formed the true foundation of her culinary vision. As the evening progressed and course after course emerged from her kitchen to increasingly enthusiastic reception among the assembled guests, Alina understood with growing certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she had truly and completely arrived at the beginning of something remarkable, something that would eventually reshape not merely her own life, but the broader understanding of what English cuisine could genuinely become when approached with genuine passion, careful technique, and an unwavering commitment to honest, meaningful flavor. The Whitmore Table did not become an overnight sensation, despite the promising energy of its opening evening. Alina quickly learned that establishing a genuine reputation within London's competitive dining scene required far more than a single successful night of enthusiastic guests. The following weeks tested her resolve in ways she had not fully anticipated, as she navigated the countless practical challenges of managing a professional kitchen, from difficult suppliers who questioned the authority of a young female head chef, to skeptical kitchen staff, initially reluctant to accept direction from someone so unconventional within their traditionally male-dominated profession. Margaret Fenwick, a formidable woman who had worked in professional kitchens for over 2 decades, proved among the most resistant to Aliner's leadership during those early weeks, her considerable experience making her deeply skeptical of a young chef whose reputation had been built, in her view, more on novelty than genuine skill. Aliner faced this resistance not with confrontation, but with patient demonstration, working alongside her staff with the same humility and genuine respect for craft that Julian had modeled for her throughout her training in Lyon, gradually earning the trust and eventual genuine admiration of even her most doubtful colleagues. "I did not believe the stories when I first heard them," Margaret admitted several weeks into their working relationship, watching Aliner demonstrate a particularly delicate technique for preparing a sauce that had given several members of the kitchen staff considerable difficulty. "I believed you were simply a fashionable curiosity, chosen for your unusual story rather than genuine talent. I confess I was entirely mistaken in that assessment." Word of the restaurant's genuine quality spread gradually but steadily through London's interconnected social circles, aided considerably by Charles Fenwick's glowing review, published in one of the city's most widely read papers several weeks after the establishment's opening, which declared Aliner's cooking to represent nothing less than a genuine reinvention of English cuisine, elevating humble and familiar ingredients into something worthy of serious culinary admiration. The review generated a surge of curious new guests eager to experience the remarkable cooking they had read about, and within a few short months, securing a reservation at the Whitmore table had become a genuine mark of social distinction among London's more discerning dining circles. Aliner's success brought with it a corresponding shift in how she was perceived within the broader circles of society that had once dismissed her as insufficiently refined for a life among the aristocracy. Invitations began arriving from households eager to secure her services for private events, requests she carefully balanced against her primary commitment to the restaurant that had given her the opportunity to prove herself. She found herself, with growing frequency, seated at gatherings not as a quiet, overlooked guest struggling to navigate unfamiliar social expectations, but as an honored guest whose unique perspective and remarkable achievements had earned her a place of genuine respect among people who would once have considered her entirely beneath their notice. Her relationship with Ashford, meanwhile, continued its slow and careful evolution during this period, the two of them working gradually toward a genuine partnership built on foundations considerably more honest than the arrangement that had originally bound them together. Ashford began, in small but meaningful ways, to assert greater independence from his mother's considerable influence, taking a more active role in managing the family's estate and finances, rather than deferring entirely to Lady Margaret's judgment, as he had throughout most of his adult life. He visited Aliner at the restaurant regularly, watching with evident pride as her reputation continued to grow, and gradually, the quiet affection that had once existed between them during their childhood years in the orchard began to reassert itself, transformed now into something more mature and genuine than the arrangement that had originally connected their families. Lady Margaret's opposition softened only gradually, and never entirely, though even she could not entirely ignore the growing social cachet attached to Aliner's remarkable success, as invitations to sample her cooking became genuinely coveted among the very social circles Lady Margaret had always cared most about impressing. It was, Aliner reflected privately, a strange and somewhat ironic validation, watching Lady Margaret's disapproval gradually transform into a grudging, carefully qualified acknowledgement of her son's, fiancé's genuine accomplishments, motivated not by any fundamental shift in the older woman's values, but by the undeniable social capital that had come to be attached to Aliner's name. A full year after the opening of the Whitmore table, Aliner received an invitation that would prove among the most significant of her still young career, a request to prepare a private dinner for members of the royal household, an honor that few chefs, regardless of their reputation or experience, could ever hope to achieve. The invitation arrived through channels connected ultimately to Henry Ashcombe, whose early belief in Aliner's talents had continued to open doors throughout her remarkable rise, and Aliner understood immediately the magnitude of what such an opportunity represented, not merely for her own career, but for the broader recognition of English cuisine as something worthy of serious international respect. She spent weeks in careful preparation for the royal dinner, drawing upon every lesson she had absorbed throughout her remarkable journey, from Grace Dunmore's humble country kitchen to Julian Moreau's refined French training, weaving together every strand of her unique culinary education into a menu that would represent, in its fullest and most complete expression, everything she had come to believe about the transformative potential of honest, thoughtfully prepared food. She wrote to Julian during this period, sharing the extraordinary news of the opportunity before her, and his reply arrived filled with genuine pride and characteristically practical advice about the specific techniques and combinations she might consider for such a significant occasion. The evening of the royal dinner arrived with a weight of anticipation, unlike anything Aliner had experienced even during her most significant earlier successes, aware as she was that the outcome of this single evening carried implications far beyond her own personal reputation. She moved through the preparations with the same calm, focused determination that had carried her through every previous challenge, trusting fully in the instincts and skills she had spent years carefully developing, while remaining true to the fundamental philosophy that had guided her entire culinary journey. Honest, thoughtfully prepared food, rooted in genuine respect for both tradition and innovation, capable of speaking to something true and lasting beneath the surface of fashionable trends. The reception, when it finally arrived through carefully relayed reports from the dining room, exceeded even Aliner's most optimistic hopes. The assembled guests reportedly moved to genuine and enthusiastic praise for a meal unlike anything they had previously encountered within English aristocratic dining traditions. Word of the evening's remarkable success spread quickly through the highest circles of English society, cementing Aliner's reputation not merely as a talented young chef, but as a genuine visionary whose innovative approach to English cuisine had begun to reshape the broader culinary landscape of the entire country. In the months that followed the royal dinner, Aliner's influence continued to expand in ways that extended far beyond the walls of her own successful restaurant. Young chefs, both men and women, began seeking her guidance and mentorship, eager to learn the techniques and philosophy that had propelled her to such remarkable success. She began, gradually, to train a small group of promising apprentices in her kitchen, passing forward the patient, generous mentorship that Julian had once offered her, ensuring that the remarkable knowledge and philosophy she had developed would continue to influence English cuisine for generations beyond her own individual career. Her relationship with Ashford continued to deepen throughout this remarkable period of professional success, the two of them gradually building a genuine partnership grounded in mutual respect and admiration, rather than the rigid social expectations that had originally shaped their engagement. Ashford, transformed by watching Aliner's courageous pursuit of her own authentic path, found himself increasingly willing to challenge his mother's continued attempts to control the direction of his own life, gradually asserting an independence that surprised even those who had known him longest. It was during this period that Ashford finally proposed a new arrangement for their eventual marriage, one built on foundations considerably different from the original engagement arranged when they were still very young. "I do not wish for you to abandon anything you have built," he told her during a quiet evening at the restaurant, watching her direct her kitchen staff with the confident authority she had developed over the preceding years. "I understand now that the woman you have become is not someone to be managed or controlled according to my mother's expectations, but someone to be genuinely partnered with, respected fully for everything you have accomplished and everything you continue to build. Alina considered his words carefully, recognizing in them a genuine transformation in Ashford's own understanding of partnership and respect, one that stood in stark contrast to the uncertain, resigned young man who had once agreed to send her away without fully considering what such a decision might mean for her own future and happiness. "I am willing to build a life together," she told him honestly, "but only if it remains a life where I continue to be exactly who I have become, without any expectation that I will shrink myself back into someone more convenient for your family's ambitions." "That," Ashford replied with genuine sincerity, "is precisely the life I now wish to build alongside you, Alina. Not the life my mother once envisioned, but the honest, remarkable life you have created entirely through your own courage and talent." The wedding between Alina Whitmore and Ashford Pembroke took place nearly 2 years after her return from France, a ceremony considerably smaller and more intimate than the grand society occasion Lady Margaret had once envisioned for her son's marriage, held instead in the quiet country church near Alina's childhood home, attended by the people who genuinely mattered most to the couple rather than the sprawling collection of social connections Lady Margaret had originally intended to invite. Alina's father walked her down the aisle with tears of genuine pride in his eyes, while Grace Dunmore, the old family cook who had first introduced Alina to the transformative power of thoughtfully prepared food, sat proudly among the small gathering of guests, having traveled a considerable distance to witness the culmination of a journey she had unknowingly set in motion so many years earlier. Julian Morrow himself made the journey from France to attend the wedding, a gesture that moved Alina deeply, understanding as she did the considerable effort such travel represented for a man whose demanding professional obligations rarely permitted extended absences from his own kitchen. He embraced her warmly following the ceremony, his weathered face carrying an expression of genuine paternal pride that Alina treasured deeply, understanding fully the profound debt she owed to his patient mentorship during her transformative year in Lyon. "I remember a quiet, uncertain girl who wandered into my kitchen on her very first night in France," Julian told her, his eyes bright with emotion. "I could not have imagined, even then, the remarkable woman she would become, or the profound way her talents would eventually reshape the culinary understanding of an entire country." Lady Margaret's attendance at the wedding, while dutifully present, carried a carefully controlled reserve that had never entirely transformed into genuine warmth toward her new daughter-in-law, though even she could not entirely deny the remarkable success and social standing Alina had achieved through her own considerable talents and determination. Over the years that followed, their relationship settled into something considerably more cordial than the outright disapproval that had characterized their early interactions, though it never fully blossomed into the close affection Alina might once have hoped for, a reminder that not every difficult relationship resolves into perfect harmony, even amid genuine personal triumph. The years following Alina's marriage brought continued and remarkable growth to her professional reputation, as the Whitmore table expanded to include a second location, and eventually, a modest but influential cooking school, where Alina personally trained a new generation of English chefs in the innovative techniques and philosophy she had developed throughout her own remarkable journey. Her influence extended increasingly beyond the walls of her own establishments, as former students and admirers carried her innovative approach to English cuisine into kitchens across the country, gradually reshaping the broader culinary landscape of the entire nation. Food critics and culinary historians of the period began, with growing frequency, to credit Alina's work with initiating what would eventually be recognized as a genuine renaissance in English cooking, a movement away from the rigid, often bland traditions that had characterized aristocratic dining for generations, toward a more thoughtful, technique-driven approach that honored traditional English ingredients while elevating them through careful preparation and genuine culinary artistry. Charles Fenwick, whose early review had helped launch Alina's public reputation, wrote extensively throughout the following decade about the profound influence her innovative philosophy had exerted upon an entire generation of English chefs, crediting her directly with fundamentally transforming how English cuisine was understood and appreciated, both domestically and increasingly among international culinary circles as well. Alina herself remained, throughout her remarkable rise to prominence, genuinely humble about the significance of her achievements, focused always more on the honest quality of the food she continued to create than on the growing reputation and recognition that inevitably accompanied her considerable success. She maintained a close correspondence with Julian throughout the years that followed, regularly exchanging new techniques and recipe innovations, and she eventually established a formal partnership between her own cooking school and Julian's continued work in France, creating an exchange program that allowed promising young chefs from both countries to study under the guidance of the two mentors, whose unlikely partnership had first sparked Alina's remarkable transformation so many years earlier. Her marriage to Ashford, while never entirely free of the complicated tensions that had originally shaped their relationship, developed over the years into a genuine and mutually respectful partnership, built on foundations considerably more honest and equal than the arrangement that had originally bound the two families together. Ashford, transformed by his years of watching Alina's courageous pursuit of her own authentic path, eventually became a genuine advocate for expanding educational and professional opportunities for women within English society more broadly, using his own considerable influence and social standing to support causes and institutions that might have seemed entirely foreign to the uncertain, deferential young man who had once agreed, without hesitation, to send his fiancée away simply because his mother deemed her insufficiently refined. Grace Dunmore, invited by Alina to join her growing culinary enterprise in its early years, spent her final working years training young apprentices alongside her former pupil. Delighting in watching the humble techniques she had once taught a curious young girl in a modest farmhouse kitchen, eventually influenced the broader culinary understanding of an entire nation. She often told visitors to Alina's kitchen, with evident pride, the story of a quiet, overlooked girl who had once seemed destined for an unremarkable life, entirely unaware of the remarkable talents that lay hidden within her, waiting patiently for the right circumstances to finally reveal themselves. Alina reflected often, throughout the years of her remarkable success, on the strange and unexpected path that had carried her from the disapproving drawing rooms of Pembroke Hall to the celebrated kitchens of her own thriving establishments. She thought frequently of Madame Bellamy's finishing house, of the formal lessons in etiquette and proper conversation that had originally seemed to represent the entire purpose of her time in France, lessons that had ultimately mattered far less to her eventual success than the late-night hours spent quietly learning beside Julian Morrow in a kitchen she was never officially meant to enter. She thought, too, of Lady Margaret's original intention to send her away for refinement, understanding now, with the clarity that only comes from considerable hindsight, that she had indeed returned from France transformed, though not remotely in the manner Lady Margaret had originally envisioned. The true refinement Alina had discovered during her time abroad had nothing to do with proper curtsies or fashionable conversation, and everything to do with a deeper and more meaningful transformation, the discovery of her own genuine talents and the courage to pursue them fully, regardless of whether they aligned with the narrow expectations others had once held for her life. She had been sent away as an uncertain, quiet girl considered insufficient exactly as she was, and she had returned as a woman who understood, with complete and unshakable clarity, precisely where her true value lay, transforming not merely her own life, but the broader culinary understanding of an entire nation in the process. Years later, when young aspiring chefs asked Alina about the secret to her remarkable success, she would often smile and share the same simple wisdom that had guided her throughout her extraordinary journey. Talent, she would tell them, often lies hidden in the places others overlook, waiting patiently for someone with genuine vision to recognize its true worth. And sometimes, she would add, with a knowing warmth in her voice, the very qualities that others once considered flaws requiring correction prove, instead, to be the foundation of something far more remarkable than anyone, including oneself, could have ever originally imagined. The quiet girl who had once been sent away to be refined had, in the end, transformed not merely herself, but the very taste of an entire country, proving beyond any doubt that true refinement comes not from conforming to the narrow expectations of others, but from the courage to discover and fully embrace one's own authentic and remarkable gifts. Many years after the wedding at the quiet country church, Alina stood once more in the kitchen of her original establishment. Now grown considerably beyond the modest space William Caro had first entrusted to her ambitious vision. The Whitmore table had become, by this point, something of an institution within London's culinary landscape, its name spoken with genuine reverence among food enthusiasts across the country, and its influence extending into kitchens throughout England, as former apprentices carried the techniques and philosophy Alina had developed into their own thriving establishments. On this particular afternoon, Alina found herself training a new group of apprentices, young men and women drawn from backgrounds considerably more varied than the aristocratic circles that had once dominated professional cooking in England. She recognized in several of them the same quiet uncertainty she herself had once carried, the sense of not quite belonging within the traditional expectations placed upon them by family or circumstance, and she made a particular point, as she always did, of encouraging these hesitant young talents to trust their own instincts rather than simply following established convention without question. The finest dishes, she told them, echoing wisdom Julian had first shared with her so many years earlier in his quiet kitchen in Lyon, come not from rigid adherence to what has always been done, but from genuine understanding of what makes a particular combination of flavors true and honest. Trust what you taste. Trust what your instincts tell you a dish requires, even when it defies convention. Among her current apprentices was a young woman named Charlotte Fenwick, no relation to the critic whose early review had helped launch Alina's public career, but a distant cousin of Margaret Fenwick, the once skeptical kitchen manager who had eventually become one of Alina's most trusted colleagues and friends. Charlotte reminded Alina considerably of her own younger self, possessing genuine natural talent, but struggling with the confidence necessary to fully trust her own creative instincts, particularly when working alongside more experienced colleagues within the demanding professional kitchen. "You are afraid of being wrong," Alina observed one afternoon, watching Charlotte hesitate over a sauce that clearly required additional seasoning, but that the young apprentice seemed reluctant to adjust without explicit permission. "I understand that fear intimately, Charlotte. I carried it with me for years before I finally learned to trust what my own palate was telling me." "How did you overcome it?" Charlotte asked, her expression carrying genuine curiosity beneath her evident uncertainty. Alina considered the question carefully before answering, drawing upon the full weight of her own remarkable journey. "I found someone who believed in my instincts before I fully believed in them myself," she said finally. "And eventually, through considerable practice and patient encouragement, that borrowed confidence became genuinely my own. I cannot give you that confidence directly, Charlotte, but I can promise you that if you continue trusting your instincts, even when you fear making a mistake, you will eventually discover the same quiet certainty I once found in Julian Morrow's kitchen so many years ago." Ashford visited the restaurant frequently during these years, no longer the uncertain young man who had once deferred entirely to his mother's rigid expectations, but a genuine partner in Alina's continued success, having taken on increasing responsibility for the business side of her growing culinary enterprise, while Alina remained focused primarily on the creative and mentorship aspects of the work that brought her the greatest satisfaction. Their partnership, built on the honest foundations they had carefully constructed together over the years, had produced not merely a successful marriage, but a genuine collaborative friendship that neither had fully anticipated when their engagement was first arranged so many years earlier by families more concerned with land boundaries than genuine compatibility. Lady Margaret, in her final years, softened considerably toward her daughter-in-law, though the warmth between them never fully matched the closeness Alina shared with her own father or with Grace Dunmore. Still, In a quiet conversation shared during one of Lady Margaret's final visits before her passing, the older woman offered Eleanor an acknowledgement that carried genuine significance, however belated it may have arrived. "I was wrong about you," Lady Margaret admitted, her voice carrying none of the sharp certainty that had once characterized her assessment of Eleanor's worth. "I believed refinement meant conforming to expectations I had inherited without ever truly questioning them myself. You have shown me, through your own remarkable example, that genuine refinement comes from somewhere considerably deeper than proper etiquette or fashionable conversation." Eleanor accepted this belated acknowledgement with genuine grace, understanding that such admissions, however late in arriving, still carried real meaning and value. She had long since released the bitterness she might once have carried toward Lady Margaret's original dismissal of her worth, recognizing that her own remarkable journey had ultimately depended, in its own strange and roundabout way, on that very dismissal, on being sent away to a place where she would unexpectedly discover a talent that might otherwise have remained hidden throughout her entire life. Julian Morrow continued his correspondence with Eleanor until his own passing many years later, their exchange of recipes and culinary philosophy never diminishing despite the physical distance that separated them across the Channel. Eleanor traveled to Lyon on several occasions throughout the years, always making time to visit the kitchen where her remarkable transformation had first begun, and Julian, in turn, visited England regularly, delighting in watching the continued growth and influence of the remarkable student whose talents he had first recognized on that fateful evening so many years earlier. "You have done something I never fully managed myself," Julian told her during one such visit, watching with evident pride as Eleanor directed her bustling kitchen with the confident authority she had developed over decades of dedicated work. "You have not merely mastered your craft. You have transformed the broader understanding of what your craft can accomplish, reshaping the culinary identity of an entire nation in the process." Eleanor often reflected, during these later years of her remarkable career, on the strange and unexpected turns her life had taken, from the quiet, uncertain girl who had once been sent away from Pembroke Hall in disgrace, to the celebrated chef whose innovative approach to English cuisine had fundamentally reshaped how an entire country understood and appreciated its own culinary traditions. She thought often of her mother, whose own remarkable gift for transforming simple ingredients into something worth remembering had first planted the seeds of Eleanor's own extraordinary talents, seeds that had lain dormant for years before finally finding the right conditions to flourish fully within Julian Morrow's welcoming kitchen. The story of Eleanor Whitmore, the quiet betrothed sent away to be refined who returned instead to transform the taste of all England, became, over the years that followed, something of a legend within English culinary circles, told and retold among aspiring chefs seeking inspiration for their own uncertain journeys. It stood as a powerful reminder that true talent often lies hidden in unexpected places, waiting patiently for the right circumstances and the right mentorship to finally reveal itself fully, and that the very qualities others might dismiss as insufficient or unrefined can, given the proper opportunity and genuine courage, transform into something far more remarkable than anyone, including oneself, might have ever originally dared to imagine. Eleanor lived out her remaining years surrounded by the family and community she had carefully built around her own authentic path, continuing to cook, to teach, and to innovate until the very final years of her long and remarkable life, always remembering with genuine gratitude the quiet kitchen in Lyon where a curious young Englishwoman had first discovered the true shape of her own extraordinary worth, and the patient mentor who had believed in her talents long before she had fully learned to believe in them herself. Her legacy endured not merely in the recipes and techniques she left behind, but in the countless lives she touched throughout her remarkable career, each one reminded, through her own extraordinary example, that true refinement comes not from conforming to the narrow expectations of others, but from the courage to discover, embrace, and fully pursue one's own authentic and remarkable gifts, wherever that pursuit might ultimately lead.